Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone across the world. You are welcome to the African Literature Association's lecture series, the first in the academic year of 2022-2023. My name is Akinyade Shokan, and I teach comparative literature and African cinema at Indiana University, Bloomington. It's been my pleasure over the past 2 years to coordinate this series with my colleagues in the Executive Council of the Association, especially Matt Brown of the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and James McCorkle of William and Hobart College in Geneva, New York. The series began 2 years ago at the height of the COVID pandemic forcing a global lockdown, but was also an imaginative initiative suggested by the president of the association at the time, Girma Negash of Ohio State University, and that continued to receive the support of the Executive Council, and particularly of subsequent presidents, Mohamed Kamara of Washington and Lee University, and Gaurav Desai of the University of Michigan, who is our current president and a co-organizer of the series. We also want to thank Dan, web manager, for making this conversation possible. In the main, the lecture series is meant to engage the members' intellectual and professional attention outside of the conference calendar, and it has had the benefit of opening literary studies up to other areas of the study of artistic expression, moving on to other fields, those other fields in the humanities and the social sciences invested in the generation of knowledge in all spheres of life. We're getting there, and those in attendance who may be new to the series are encouraged to review past lectures dating back to September 2022 to get a sense of the diversity of subjects and scholars featured. As always, we acknowledge the continued support of other members of the council, as well as the larger membership of the association. Due to your continuing attention and attendance, the series has come to stand in the past 2 years as a publicly engaged feature of the association's presence in this age when public engagement is roughly equivalent to being socially or civically responsive. Thank you, everyone. Today's lecture is the first one in this academic year, and it will be given by the Emeritus Professor of Social Anthropology at Stockholm University, Professor Ulf Hannerz. His name has come up in this series before as one of the distinguished anthropologists who bring a sophisticated attention to the analysis of artistic forms, literature in his case. Earlier in this year, Hannerz published Afropolitan Horizons, Essays Towards a Literary Anthropology, a work that stands as a report of 60 years of research and writing about Nigeria from the standpoint of its literary culture. Scholars and writers familiar with Professor Hannerz's work know of the scope of the research, his interest in topics such as creolization, diasporicity, worldliness, and the somewhat controversial but captivating term Afropolitanism, enabling him to synthesize an immense amount of materials from divergent generic and generational backgrounds. Due to this innovative method, which places Nigeria at the center of particular expressions of worldliness, the reader is made aware of the pertinence of the co-appearance of Amos Tutuola, and the shadowy author Baba of Karo, of Cyprian Ekwensi and Sarah Ladipo Mayinka, as well as the impact of a constellation of Nigerian cities on the diasporic renewal of African literary and cultural expressions. Professor Hannerz is the author of several other books, including World Watching, Transnational Connections, Exploring the City, and Soulside. The title of his lecture today, is Writing Nigeria, 60 Years in Literary Anthropology. You're welcome, Professor Hannerz.
Well, thank you very much, Akin. I hope this will all work out technically. And hello, everybody, wherever you may be. I am still in my summer house in southern Sweden, a house which has been mine for over 50 years now. You may wonder why an elderly Swede like me would come to do a book on writings about Nigeria. Part of the answer goes a long way back to the early 1960s. The Scandinavian countries had not played any very notable part in recent world history, but those were times of change. Our countries were opening up to the world, and many young Scandinavians were interested in the way a number of new African countries were gaining independence from whatever European colonialism they had been under. I was one of them, and this curiosity took me on a couple of journeys to West Africa, mostly to Nigeria, but also to Ghana, journeys basically of a backpacking nature. This also resulted in my first book on Nigeria 60 years ago. The title Palaverland works in English as well, although the book was in Swedish. That interest also took me into anthropology, the only discipline at the university which could possibly tell me more about Africa. But I was not impressed with what I could get out of my home university in Stockholm. So I went on for a year as an exchange student at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana, which had a strong anthropology department and a young and lively African studies program. I had certainly planned that my first real field study should take me back to Nigeria. By the time I was getting ready for the field, however, the southeastern part of the country had tried to secede, and the Biafra War resulted. This was not time for fieldwork there. And I found myself instead for 2 years as a participant observer in an inner city Black neighborhood in Washington, D.C. By the 1970s, it was time for me to return to Nigeria. I made my way to Kafanchan, a town that had grown up in the colonial period around a new railway junction in the middle of the country. And I returned for several stays in the 1970s and 1980s. I should actually thank one writer in the first generation of Nigerian novelists for the way it all turned out. On one of these early Nigeria trips of mine, the train I was on stood still for quite a while at the station in Kafanchan, with a lot of action around it, and the name of the town stuck in my mind. Then, soon after, I read the novel Blade Among the Boys by Onwara Nzekwu, and the book really opens with a brief mini-ethnography of Kafanchan. Nzekwu was actually the son of a railway family, so he spent his early life there. That sketch of town life appealed to me, so on a reconnaissance trip to decide where I would do my research, I went to Kafanchan first and found that I liked it. It was a comfortable field site. I could walk around most of it in a couple of hours. The focus of my research was on the relationship between ethnic diversity and the division of labor. Some of the townspeople were from nearby, but there were also migrants from just about all over Nigeria, making their livelihood in many ways. As I listened to casual conversations among the people I came to know, I heard a lot of gossip about local everyday life, but I also found a preoccupation with the world outside. Horizons could stretch beyond city limits, beyond the country's borders. A central social type in the mid-20th century Nigerian English vocabulary was the Bintu, the person who had been overseas, most often to the United Kingdom, the old colonial power, and had returned with the capital of knowledge convertible into power and affluence. In Kafanchan, real-life Bintus must have been very few and far between. Yet, in the collective imagination, they were well represented. And they showed up in Nigerian fiction too, for instance, in one of Chinua Achebe's novels. In real life, as well as in writings, probably the Bintu was most often someone from southern Nigeria, from the areas which had longest been involved with external trade, and not least with schools run by Christian missions. But then I should say that Emirs in London, another book published this year by Vanderbilt University history professor Moses Ochonu, shows how the British colonial government took various Muslim rulers from northern Nigeria on tours of Britain to cultivate their positive feelings about that country. So Ochonu points out that the emirs became Bintus as well. I returned to Kafanchan for several field studies in the 1970s and 1980s, developing my understanding of its internal diversity as well as its external ties, its place in the world. By the 1980s, however, Nigeria was again experiencing more difficult times. Until the late 1990s, there was a series of military regimes, one worse than the other, ending up in sheer gangsterism. As a lone foreign ethnographer, I felt I would just be too vulnerable if I were to return to Kafanchan. And so my research engagement with Nigeria moved to a back burner while I went on to other things. Nonetheless, my interest in the country was undiminished. The first generation of Nigerian fiction writers had begun to draw the attention of the outside world in those years around independence. Amos Tutuola, Chinua Achebe, Cyprian Ekwensi. Indeed, the first writer in Black Africa to win a Nobel Prize in Literature was also a Nigerian of that generation, Wole Soyinka. Achebe's first novel, Things Fall Apart, may still be the great African novel. I had read them, but I kept reading the new fiction. Nigerian politics and economy may have continued to vacillate, but the country's literary production has been remarkably successful. You can go to a good bookstore just about anywhere in the world and on the shelf for international fiction, find several great Nigerian writers. Early in the alphabetical order, you may find Achebe Chinua, and soon thereafter, Adichie Chimamanda Ngozi, perhaps with her novel about the Biafra War, or Americana, her story of the contemporary life of a transnational migrant woman. A half-century or so passed between these, but in that period, a great many other writers also got to my shelves. There was Flora Nwapa, for example, and there were Ben Okri and Teju Cole and Chigozie Obioma. So a few years ago, there I was in the attic of my summer house where I am today. I was looking at shelves where my books, pamphlets, and old magazines about Nigeria had accumulated over the years, in large part fiction, but some social commentary and other non-fiction as well. The academic literature was elsewhere. I wondered what I could do with it all. And then it struck me that here were the materials for a book. Moreover, it could be an adventure in that branch of my discipline, which had been emerging in recent years as a literary anthropology. This has become a lively part of the discipline. It takes various forms, turning ethnography into something less like conventional academic styles, more like creative nonfiction, autoethnography, placing the anthropologist's own life story in a wider context, reflexive fieldwork accounts portraying the personal experience of immersion in a field, and other kinds, but also the anthropological study of literature itself, as finished texts, as well as a kind of life and work set in its social context. Frequently, this involves drawing on field research, in inspecting and commenting on literary work. This is what I have attempted to do. The result is a memoir of one reader's encounters with writings, and occasionally and briefly with writers as well, not very respectful of the boundaries of established genres and disciplines. I'm in a continuous back and forth movement between texts and what I know in other ways, from personal experience and from field study. Then quite usefully, This new term has also shown up in literary and cultural debate to express the transnational openness of contemporary African life and thought. Afropolitans. One central source was an essay named Bye Bye Babar by Haile Selassie, herself born in London, with a Ghanaian father and a Nigerian mother, raised in Massachusetts, and with university degrees from Yale and Oxford. The opening scene in the essay is from a London bar. The whole scene, writes Selassie, speaks of the cultural hybrid. These Afropolitans, either born in Africa or the children of African transnational migrants, quote unquote, belongs to no single geography, but feel at home in many. They are engaged in creating other Africas, Selassie says, and other connections between Africa and the world. So that is where I get the term Afropolitan for the title of my book. But another central contributor to the commentary on Afropolitanism has been the historian Achille Mbembe, born in Cameroon with an academic career taking him through the United States to South Africa. If Haile Selassie's portrayal of the Afropolitans is more presentist and a bit elitist, Mbembe has given more historical and philosophical depth to the notion. That, in a way, matches my own understandings more closely. My own feeling is that Nigeria was already Afropolitan before it became Nigeria, a land connecting in important ways to more distant parts of the world. The transatlantic slave trade was already one part of this. Looking eastward, there's been the wish of Muslims to make the pilgrimage to Mecca. But from my Kafanchan experience, I could also remember the Bintu. It struck me that Haile Selassie's 21st century Afropolitans had Bintus as their conceptual ancestors from the century before. In fact, before the Bintus, there had also been those young Nigerian men who had been made to serve far away as soldiers when the British Empire fought Japan in Southeast Asia in World War II. There is a novel about them, Burma Boy, by B.E. Bandele from 2007. Bandele's father had been a Burma Boy himself, so Bandele could draw in part on family memories. But I also discovered that Bandele was born in Kafanchan in 1967. When I was there in the 1970s, he may have been among the boys I would encounter in the town streets. And now I have just learned that Bandele died last month in Lagos, just before he was to return to London, where he was nowadays living. Getting into my own writing, I would draw not only on Nigerian fiction, but also other writers dealing with the country in one way or other. Some had been there as foreign news correspondents, such as the famous Polish journalist Ryszard Kapuscinski, or John Darnton of the New York Times, expelled by a military regime when his reporting became inconvenient. Darnton's wife, Nina Darnton, would actually later write a detective story based in Lagos, mostly about its expatriates. I went back to the autobiographical writings by the last generation of British colonial officers. I could even link their writing to a couple of interviews I had done in London in the 1970s with men who had been district officers in Kafanchan some 20 years earlier. They enjoyed the interviews and became a bit nostalgic. One of them had been in Kafanchan to organize a local celebration of the coronation of Queen Elizabeth in 1953. And then, as some additional spice, I could reminisce about my brief encounters with a few of these Nigerian authors, Amos Tutuola in Ibadan, Cyprian Ekwensi in Lagos, and Wole Soyinka at the Nobel Prize dinner in Stockholm. Not least, however, my zigzagging writing project related the writing of fiction to anthropological writing. Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, of course, is about life among the Igbo people at the time when colonialism arrived. Now I could place it next to a brief textbook on Igbo culture and society by Victor Uchendu, himself Igbo and more or less an age mate of Achebe, who went to the United States for higher education, did field research among the Navajo Indians for his doctorate, and became an anthropology professor at the University of Illinois. When a prominent Brazilian novelist, Antonio Olinto, wrote a book about an ex-slave family returning across the ocean to a new life in old homelands along the West African coast, I could compare that story to my friend Laurent Madory's historical anthropology of Afro-Brazilians and the continued linkages across the Black South Atlantic. Madory is an anthropology professor at Duke University. Incidentally, I recently discovered one more link between the Afro-Brazilians and recent Black fiction writing. Bernardine Evaristo, the Black British writer who earned a Booker Prize for her novel Girl, Woman, Other of 2019, tells us in her recent memoir that her paternal grandfather had been among those freed slaves who returned late in the 19th century from Brazil to Nigeria. And then his son moved to London and found a Welsh wife. Crossing the South Atlantic, the Afro-Brazilians made their way to Lagos, and Lagos has continued to be very visible in Nigerian writing. After Abuja came into being in the late 20th century, Lagos is no longer the national capital. But with its openness to the world, now with some 25 or 30 million inhabitants, a difficult yet oddly attractive place, there is a continuous preoccupation with it in Nigerian writing. A pioneer in portraying Lagos life was Cyprian Ekwensi. By the time I met him briefly in Lagos in 1961, he was Director of Information Services, an upper-level civil servant with his office in the center of Lagos, seated behind a large desk with a color print of the young Queen Elizabeth on the wall behind his back. This was in the brief period, just after the arrival of independence, when she was still Nigerian head of state. The Republic and the presidency with an indigenous occupant came about a couple of years later. By then, Cyprian Ekwensi had just published his second novel on Lagos life, Jagwanana, in 1961. Jaguar is actually a nickname after the British luxury car. The woman in question is leading a very diverse life, in large part on the night shift, involved in one way or other in the fashion business, organized crime, and politics, by way of one male friend or other. What she really hopes is that a promising young man who lives in the same building will move on to England and study law, and then come back to marry her, so she will have a good life after she has stopped being so attractive to other men. So she supports his venture. But the young man is really more attracted to a younger woman, as becomes very clear when he returns from overseas. There are some deaths along the way, in crime as well as politics, and in the end, Jaguar leaves Lagos, starting a new life as a merchant princess in another city. I can imagine Cyprian Ekwensi rising from that desk with a portrait of Queen Elizabeth behind him and going home to write about Jagwanana. After that, he actually did a couple of short books on northern Nigerian cattle herders, their lives and stories on the savannah far from any city. And then with Divided We Stand, he places his story in the middle of the Biafra War, where he was himself on the Biafra side. Okay, So Lagos continues to fascinate writers, but we can't stay there. I proceed in my book to discuss 4 more southern Nigerian cities, Ibadan, Enugu, Onitsha, and Nsukka, to point to their important roles in the history of Nigerian literary activity. Ibadan had Nigeria's first university and a lively intellectual scene. In Onitsha, I can point to the remarkable petty industry of pamphlet publishing, linked in the mid-20th century to the major Onitsha market next to the River Niger. But there is also the French Mauritian writer J.M.G. Leclésio, a Nobel Prize winner in literature in 2008, with his novel Onitsha. Leclésio had spent a part of his boyhood in Nigeria when his father was there as an expatriate doctor. Nsukka, for its part, is another university town with a lively history, known to a large audience through the writings of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Most better-known Nigerian writers have been from the south of the country. I devote one chapter, however, to a fairly early northerner, Ibrahim Tahir. Tahir actually went to Cambridge University in England and earned a doctorate in social anthropology there when, in late colonial, early post-colonial times, Cambridge stood out as a center of West African anthropology. Then Tahir returned to the first Northern Nigerian university, Ahmadu Bello University in Zaria, and became a major figure there in academic politics. But Tahir did find time to do a novel, The Last Imam, in 1984, the tragic story of a powerful Muslim savant in Bauchi, the somewhat peripheral city where Ibrahim Tahir had himself grown up. Then, staying in the north, I could also devote a chapter to the real non-fiction life history of Baba Okaro, the northern Nigerian woman born in the late 19th century, who witnessed the arrival of the British colonialists and lived through 3 marriages. In a way, the author, Mary Smith, served as Baba's ghostwriter. This is a first-person narrative. Anthropology certainly comes in here. The book, Baba Okaro in 1954, was in part the outcome of the gender division of academic labor, as it was for much of the 20th century. Mary Smith was the spouse of M.G. Smith, whose successful but more conventional monographs about Northern Nigerian Emirates brought him professorships at University College London and Yale University. His wife, not in an academic career, but with him in the field, could afford to do a more original kind of writing. As a life history, Baba Okaro is, of course, in large part a depiction of everyday life and its social relationships. Certainly, my interest in Nigerian fiction has also in large part been in such topics. Much of it has its strengths here. It may perhaps be described as social realists. Work by Chinua Achebe and Cyprian Ekwensi, for example, are mostly of this sort. But then occasionally I enjoy finding work, drawing creatively on what I see as a cultural heritage of imagination, in what seems rather more as magical realism. You might say that Amos Tutuola started this with The Palm Wine Drinker in the early 1950s, inspired by the folk tales of the Yoruba people. But then it has come back recently, for example, in Nnedi Okorafor's Lagoon of 2014, where a shift-changing being named Ayodele, extraterrestrial, amphibious, sometimes a green lizard, sometimes a swordfish, eventually turns into a mist after creating utter chaos in metropolitan Lagos. There is also Chigozie Ogioma's An Orchestra of Minorities of 2019, where the life story of a transnational migrant is narrated in line with Igbo tradition by his guardian spirits. After The Last Imam and Baba Okaro, I turn in my book to the fictional writings about the Biafra War as it went on between 1967 and 1970. Again, Cyprian Ekwensi wrote about it, but also Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie in her breakthrough Half of a Yellow Sun in 2007, and the pioneer woman novelist Flora Nwapa with Never Again in 1975. And there would be Ken Saro-Wiwa's Sosa Boy in 1985. Saro-Wiwa was also a Niger Delta political activist. As such, he was executed in 1995 by the particularly sordid military regime of General Sani Abacha. I am moving to the later chapters of my book, and from a civil war in southeastern Nigeria across the Atlantic to those Afropolitan stories based in the United States, some non-fiction and social commentary, some fiction. Early on, there was John Pepper Clark's America, Their America in 1964. A youthful academic stipendiate, Clark dwells in large part on how little Americans know about Africa and what strange ideas they had about it. Obviously, he does not mind telling them about it and comes across as pretty arrogant. He overhears a comment about himself. Of course, the young man may be a genius, but how can I possibly ask friends over to meet him when you show such a penchant for making enemies? Soon enough, Pepper Clark's hosts are happy to see him return to Nigeria. Uke Ndibe, on the other hand, comes to remain, writing both cultural commentary and fiction about complicated traffic back and forth between Igbo land and New York. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie and Teju Cole, the most renowned of recent Afropolitan writers, also combine fiction and social commentary. And then there is Sarah Ladipo Manika's highly acclaimed novel, Like a Mule Bringing Ice Cream to the Sun in 2016. Her central figure is an elderly Nigerian woman who, after a life here and there in the world as the undiplomatic wife of a diplomat, has become an American literature professor. A rather lonely life with the closest relationship to her equally elderly car. Ladipo Manika, the author, is herself a college professor in San Francisco. Then in the final chapter of Afropolitan Horizons, I turn around to have a quick look at expressions of African American interest in Africa generally, and what is now Nigeria especially. I think it's fair to say that it was an interest which grew in much the same period as I first became involved with Nigeria myself. Mostly, this final chapter is not so much about fiction. More is about two Black communities in the southeastern United States. One is in these coastal wetlands, which have been the home of the people known as Gullah or Geechee. In the days of slavery, plantation owners here became more or less absentee landlords. And so the slaves, turning into ex-slaves and descendants of slaves, had an unusual degree of cultural autonomy. By the 1930s, a Black linguist, Lorenzo Dow Turner, took it upon himself to do a study of the Gullah dialect and found that it was not just a bad English, but could be described as a Creole language. It took some time to get his monograph, Africanisms in the Gullah Dialect, published by a reputable university press, but with time it became a classic. Meanwhile, pursuing his interest in African and African-influenced language forms, Turner made his way to both Brazil and Nigeria. The other African-American community in southeastern United States, which I focus on, is in South Carolina, just a little north of the old harbor town of Beaufort, and named Oyutunji Village. I made my way there myself once for a brief visit. A roadside sign announced that you are now leaving the United States of America. Beyond the sign was something indeed looking rather like a contemporary southern Nigerian town. The story of Oyotunji village begins with Walter Eugene King, born in Detroit in 1928, taking an interest in African culture already as a teenager. He joined the local Afro-Cuban Santeria cult, brought to the United States by migrants from Cuba. But he became dissatisfied as he wanted something more authentically African. He read up on what he could find of historical and anthropological sources on Yoruba religion, started a Yoruba temple, and renamed himself Adefunmi. Then, in 1970, with 5 families accompanying him, Adefunmi moved from New York to South Carolina and managed to buy 10 acres of uninhabited land on which Oyotunji village was built. Adefunmi was crowned as Oba, the Yoruba kingship title. The villagers then were reinvented Yoruba, born again Yoruba. They sought contacts in Nigeria and began traveling there. In other words, here was a reverse Afropolitanism, Americans reaching out from the North American periphery to an attractive African center. By the time I made my one-day visit to Oyotunji village, however, there were no longer so many people living there. The village has had its continued ups and downs, but apparently it had become less a place to live, more a place to visit, a bit of a modest African-American theme park. And as it happened, my visit to Oyotunji village was just a few days after the 2008 American presidential election. The United States had just elected its first Black president, Barack Obama. With a Kenyan father, he was Afropolitan #1. So those days may not have been a time when most Black Americans were so inclined to give up on their country. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. You actually took slightly less than 40 minutes, and that's quite impressive. Thank you. This is a quite suggestive and rich lecture, and we're quite grateful to have you take us down these multiple locations where your work's taken you in the last 60 years. And thank you. It's really both about Nigeria or about the Black world in general, especially in terms of how things go back and forth, people, ideas, and other forms of practices. And it's quite interesting how you ended on a note of both Oyotunji and the election of Barack Obama, which actually sort of seemed to be a reversion, if you want, of the idea of being to the Afropolitan. So I think these are actually very interesting ideas to argue with or to have dialogue about. So thank you again. And if you can see me, I'm actually giving you a digital applause. I can use the emoji, but as you can see my hand. As I explained, our practice is to have audience who are on YouTube give us questions or comments about what they've been listening to for the past 40 minutes or so. And as soon as we have that, we will share them with you, and you yourself can actually have access to them. But before that, while waiting for that, there's actually one. I'll quickly read that. I was going to bring one up, but let me just quickly read this, which is coming from Joya Urize, who is the current vice president of the association. she thanks you very much for the lecture and was intrigued by your idea of reverse Afropolitanism. It's actually quite interesting. Can you please elaborate on it? So we start with that, and as more questions come in, we'll share those, but let's start with this. Thank you.
Okay, do you hear me now? I guess so. I'm not sure that I, really developed the idea of reverse Afropolitanism much beyond what I happen to have in that formulation. But of course, in a way, the greater interest in Africa, which I think you can certainly see among African Americans pretty much in those 60 years is a sort of reverse Afropolitanism. I mean, Africa becomes an important part of the heritage. African Americans begin to think of themselves to a degree as an African diaspora, which I think goes well with the notion of reverse Afropolitanism. I have in the back of my mind what was it, the book by Alex Haley on Kunta Kinte, and then the TV series that was, I think, also made from that, which
Roots.
I think really, brought a lot of interest in the West African heritage of African Americans. And then, of course, you have a great many other writings, Afrocentrism as an academic interest, and so on, developing over the last half century or so.
Okay, so there's something following up on that, actually. This is also from another attendees online, Moradin Adejumobi, a former president of the association and a professor at the University of California, UC Davis. The question is whether you could say more about your use of the term Afropolitan. For example, you described the founders of Oyotunji village as Afropolitans, since they emphasize return, not openness. The idea is that they are interested in a return to source, not an openness to the world as such. So in what sense can the term Afropolitan apply to those?
I'm not quite sure I got the...
So the idea is that the people of Oyotunji village in South Carolina, actually, when they recreate the Africa or Yoruba town in that village or town, if you want, or Yoruba culture, the idea is, in fact, to return to reclaim that past, to return to the source, so to speak. It's a term that's often used about how people try to reclaim their past. So what she's suggesting is that, in fact, rather than an openness to the world, which we've come to associate with Afropolitan, that this is actually something more direct, more specific in terms of the experience of cultural dislocation.
There's a lot that could be said about Oyotunji village in South Carolina. There is actually one very strong and detailed anthropological monograph about it, which would be the source for a lot of my knowledge beyond my own quick visit. And Oyotunji village shows up here and there in other historical accounts as well. So, I mean, I would have had no problem just finding enough to say for 40 minutes about just Oyotunji village.
Yep.
Well, one thing about it is that when these sort of reinvented Yoruba then sought contact with present-day Yoruba in Nigeria, they tended to become a bit perhaps disappointed because they found that many present-day Yoruba, of course, were not adherents of traditional Yoruba religion at all, but Christians and Muslims of quite a variety of kinds, sort of, and also Yoruba in Nigeria tended to shout Oyinbo after them, as they did after me, sort of, because that's a term for sort of a stranger, most of whom, of course, would have been white or European descent. But so the people from Oyotunji village also found themselves sorted into that category.
Okay, can I follow up a little on that? Well, not so much on the Oyotunji village, but more on Afropolitanism, especially the way you sort of try to relate it to the idea of Ibintu in early Nigerian writing. So you seem to suggest, and I hope I heard you right, that there was some sort of generational relationship between those two concepts. I find that to be a very interesting, very suggestive connection to make, and I wonder if you could say more about it. For instance, the Bintu, as represented in Nigerian novels, say No Longer At Ease by Chinua Achebe, or Interpreters by Wole Soyinka, is some sort of satirical figure, widely viewed with that disapproval rather than the kind of approving nod that's given to the Afropolitan, at least as we sort of currently understand it. So, I mean, I just want you to elaborate more on the connections that you're trying to draw between the Bintu and the Afropolitan. And I have a follow-up question, but if you can just take that now so we don't overwhelm you. Thank you.
Well, the perhaps most important literary account of the life of the Bintu that I found in important Nigerian literature was in Chinua Achebe's No Longer at Ease, which is sort of the tragic story of a Bintu who comes back, is involved with another young, actually Igbo woman who is also a Bintu, and they have great difficulty handling their relationship, which ends rather tragically. What I also do in writing about the Bintu is that I draw a kind of parallel between this figure as a marginal man, as the term went into in classic American sociology, not least from the Chicago School of Sociology, where marginal people sort of being between two cultures tend to be seen as people leading difficult and often tragical lives. And then I think at some point, that changes. So I have a quote which may be from Salman Rushdie, actually, showing how so much cultural creativity actually comes out of that kind of in-between situation. Salman Rushdie, of course, is also a person in the news just the last few weeks, but I think also, if I remember it correctly now, that Wole Soyinka cites Salman Rushdie as one of his favorite authors, sort of with a similar understanding of what comes out of mixture and migration and transnational lives and so on.
All right. Well, there's one more question. I actually wanted to hear more from you about that question because I guess I'm interested in you sort of addressed it about the fact that, you know, a figure like Rushdie takes a different tack to the idea of being in between rather than tragic, but more creative. And so are you suggesting that that's how Afropolitanism is viewed vis-a-vis the Bantu? Do you think, so I guess I'm just interested in whether you think there's been some kind of generational change or whether it's because the representation of the two figures are like polar opposite, but you don't seem to be sort of suggesting that kind of polarity. You seem to be suggesting some kind of continuity.
I think, you know, as people not only from Nigeria, but pretty much anywhere in Africa leading transnational lives, well, there have been changes, but I think, you know, by now you find this much more, I think, positive attitude toward transnational lives and creativity. And I mean, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's Americana book, of course, is one example of this. And I thought it was rather fun that Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie has this meeting in Lagos between some number of quite sophisticated may mostly be Afropolitan transnational migrants, and they sort of make fun of the Bantu term, which I think is so old-fashioned, sort of, but still, I mean, in a way, even Adichie sort of points to a sort of historical linkage in her own rather satirical way.
Okay.
I saw a question from another...
Two questions, actually. Two questions. There's a follow-up from Moradun Adejumobi about the relation between cultural creolization, which is quite early in your work, and why you chose to focus on Afropolitanism to discuss cultural diversity rather than cultural creolization. That's one. So if you want to take that. But there's another question about how to relate this concept of Afropolitanism to French-speaking and other Africans, because it's understood to be some kind of specifically Anglophone, if you want, coinage or creation. So if you want to take those two questions, follow up from Professor Adejumobi, and then the question about diversifying.
I'll at least take on the question about creolization, which I noticed came from somebody with whom I've been in very enjoyable email contact recently at the University of California, Davis. Okay, this all sort of comes together with my concern with what I saw in Kafanchan in the 1970s and 80s. You know, there was so much in Western, I mean, both European and North American writing and theorizing these days. I mean, you had the modernization theorists, which kind of suggested that the world, when it got interconnected, would become pretty much all the same, and so many cultures would just sort of disappear with modernization. And you had, from a more radical point of view, people talking about cultural imperialism, which also tended to suggest that, well, with cultural imperialism, so many of the cultures of the world would be pushed out and cultural diversity would be gone, more or less. And that's not what I saw in Kafanchan. I mean, I saw, you know, this popular culture, not least in music, with high life music and Juju music and all that. And I went to hear the concerts by these people when they came through Kafanchan. and got lots of records, which I still have on myself in Stockholm and play fairly frequently. And so then I came across an early article by one anthropologist named Johannes Fabian, who is originally German with an interesting life history, then was a professor for some time in the United States and then in Amsterdam, and now I guess he lives in retirement back in Germany again. Sort of. But Johannes Fabian has this discussion of popular culture, basically in the Congo, what was Zaire at the time when he was doing the work, I guess, where he pointed out that, well, you could distinguish between pidgin cultures, like pidgin languages, which would be purely sort of contact languages, very sort of minimal, only sort of the vocabulary you needed for talking to strangers, sort of. But then he pointed out that, well, on the other hand, there were the Creole languages, which became sort of the mother tongues of a lot of people, and it was typical of them that they developed as complete languages and could become the mother tongues of a lot of people, but typically they were on a sort of center-periphery scale with some powerful standard language at one end, like standard English or standard French or whatever, and then with a variety of dialects on a sort of continuum reaching all the way to some form which would have much more to do with the language of the so-called periphery, sort of, which may have been kind of the bush villages around Kafanchan and so on, but the Creole languages would have a counterpart in Creole cultures, which developed out of the mixture, the merger, the creative work done with things that met somewhere between the center and the periphery. And when Lorenzo Dow Turner talked about the Galla or Geechee dialect in the wetlands of southeastern United States as Creole languages, well, he had already then in the 1930s caught on to one part of this continuum between the powerful standard of the European or American world and what went all the way to somewhere in Africa. And of course, the Galla or Geechee, I think, as I understand it, it's still a matter of debate precisely what African roots were most involved there. Does that sort of more or less satisfy your question?
Yeah, well, at least I'm sure she's hearing that, and if there's need for follow-up, I'm sure she'll bring that up. But do you want to take the next question from Professor Babaka Mbai, Professor of English at Pan-African and Pan-African Studies at Kent State University, regarding how to relate the concept of Afropolitanism to other, if you want, African, Francophone or non-Anglophone countries or cultures on the continent or writings?
You know, this I don't really feel particularly qualified to answer. I mean, I realize, of course, that while I've been reading not only Nigerian, but mostly writings by African writers in English, well, the Francophone story is in some ways similar and in some ways different. I think the French style of colonialism was quite different from the British style, and so in a way, perhaps the early French writers, the ones connected with présence africaine and négritude and all that, somehow probably, as I remember it now, were rather more dependent on the French cultural circles and so on. And there is the additional part of the complexity here that I think the French Caribbean connection with the well, Guadeloupe and a variety of Francophone islands, the connection between them and French West Africa, French-speaking West Africa, the Francophonie, were sort of closer than I think the connections between the English-speaking Caribbean islands and West Africa were. I'm sure one would find exceptions to this as well. I mean, one name that comes up in my mind is that of C.L.R. James, who of course wrote important books connecting the Anglophonie in various ways, being, for one thing, an expert on cricket, which he has, well, I think he was actually a cricket expert in British media, and so he shows up somewhere in at least one footnote. And I remember actually hearing him speak at the University of Pittsburgh when I taught there in the early 70s.
Mm-hmm. Okay, all right. Well, so I just wanted to, I'm waiting for that question, but while waiting, I wanted to ask you to speak more about Baba of Karo. This is a text that's not that well known to most people, including Nigerian scholars of Nigerian literature, and it features prominently in this book. Can you basically, maybe in an informational way, can you tell us about this book, its genesis, and how you find it interesting? What's it about?
Well, it's Baba's life history, and I mean, it starts out when she is a young woman, perhaps a teenager in the late 19th century, and how the young women traded in the marketplaces, and how they also were sort of favorable in giving some of their income to the praise singers who they would also find in these markets. And it's really, quite a lively discussion of northern Nigeria, and basically house life as it was from the late 19th century and through pretty much the first half of the 20th century. And there is very little sign of colonialism in this account. Some of Baba's women friends, when they heard that there was this white woman sort of taking up her time and also actually moving her out of her village to Zaria, where it was easier for the Smiths to work, well, they warned her that those Europeans might fly her off to a foreign country, because what they know was that the airport in Kano had these aircrafts coming in. It had been quite active during World War II as some sort of center for British traffic. But on the whole, I mean, Baba of Cairo is very much an internal story to a house of life, and I mean the account of how she, in large part, I guess, because she remained childless, was turned over from one husband to the next, and her ways of dealing with these rather complicated marital relations and relations to her in-laws and so on. I think, I happen to have the original edition from, I think, 1954 on my shelf, but then I think there was a new edition published possibly by Yale University Press by the time her husband, M.G. Smith, went there to become a professor later on. Whether you can now find it at Amazon or something like that, I'm not quite sure, but I think it's well worth reading, and then one can connect her story to sort of later, more academic styles of writings about house or women's life and that sort of thing.
Okay, well, thank you for that. It would be interesting actually to know if there's a new edition of the book or if a reprint is possible, because we always know about it anecdotally, but until I listened to your talk here, I think about 3 or 4 years ago, I was minimally aware of it as a text that was still available or accessible. So it would be interesting to know if there's that.
It's probably already a relatively old edition also, but at least there was a second edition. Sort of.
Okay.
And, it's the first edition, I think, is a curious case of colonial and male-dominated scholarship in the way that there is a foreword by Professor Daryl Ford in London, who was a very centrally located scholar of Africa, running the International Africa Institute, and so he writes about it mostly as M.D. Smith's wife. I'm not even sure he mentions the name Mary Smith in his foreword, and so I think, as a case of what academic life and Africanist scholarship was like in, let's say, the 1950s, it's a rather intriguing case. By the way, I also guided Daryl Ford around Stockholm at one time in the early 60s. So that's sort of one more connection to this complicated history.
Fascinating. Yeah. So one question that I meant to ask earlier, but which actually still, I think now that you mentioned Daryl Ford, seems to be pertinent, is the way in which how the way, if you want, established anthropologists received and continue to receive your work. You mentioned at the beginning of the talk that you found yourself among a crop of anthropologists at Indiana University, where I'm speaking from right now. But your work is still quite unusual in the field, in the sense that its approach to ethnography is multi-sited and multi-ethnic, whereas an anthropologist would study a particular cultural system, say the Bambara, rather than the entirety of Mali as such, which is essentially some kind of colonial paradigm. And I guess I'm just interested in what kind of response or reception your work that is kind of sideways to this kind of established approach as received from anthropologists, if you're able to sort of assess that literature, that response.
Not quite sure.
You want me to rephrase the question? So I'm saying that I wanted to know, for the purpose of our audience, how established anthropologists, that is conventional in terms of those who study cultures, like ethnic cultures, so to speak, because anthro is essentially based on the idea of ethnicity, which is not actually far from the way in which colonial system conceived of these groups. Whereas your work is actually, as you said, is also multi-ethnic. You're interested in those spaces where different ethnicities sort of coexist. So I'm saying that it's also the textual approach, reading literature and making relationship that are not strictly cultural. So how do anthropologists, when you go to their conferences, or when you have some kind of communication or conversations or dialogues with them, what's the response to your work if you are in a position to assess that kind of reception? That's what I'm asking.
Still not easy to answer. Of course, you know, when you refer to my history at your present university, Indiana, in Bloomington, I think when I came there in the 60s, that was also so much a case of the history at the time, sort of, that much of Africa had just gained independence. There were African studies programs being set up at some number of US universities. And in part, I think this was certainly politically motivated, that the Cold War was on and one wanted to make sure that these new African countries had a friendly understanding of the US. And of course, John Pepper Clark's 1960s visit, I think, is very funny book, sort of, about how little most Americans at that time knew or understood about Africa. But at the same time, of course, the people that I would meet at the African Studies program at Indiana had, I think, a very updated understanding in most cases of Africa. And I think in that way, it probably differed a fair amount from what you still would have in British academia, for instance, where there was probably still more of the colonial attitude around. I remember this joke about how back in the, let's say, 1930s or something, the Africanists that had the Northwestern University, Professor Melville Herskowitz as a central figure, well, they could have a meeting of Africanists in the US in a telephone booth. So it really had a very quick development in the Cold War era and in the 1960s and so on. There is also some story about, I think, Vice President Nixon at the time coming to Ghana in the late 1950s. You may know the story about his finding himself next to a black person at some gathering and seeing how does it feel to be free, and the black American says, "I'm still not free."
Yeah, because he's an American, he's an African American, not an African. Yes, and this was during the inauguration of Nkrumah's presidency in 1957, when he was vice president to Eisenhower, I believe. Anyway, so well, thank you for.
I don't think that's in my book anywhere, but you know, when I was in Ghana in 1963, Kwame Nkrumah had just returned from Addis Ababa and the founding of the Organization of African Unity, as I remember it. And so I was on the visiting shelf at the National Assembly building in Ghana, hearing Kwame Nkrumah speaking to this and signing the document, founding it, and then the secretary of the Convention People's Party started the party song. There is victory for us. One of the memories of my life.
Yeah. It's a very interesting song. It came up later as part of the soundtrack in the play The Night of the Elephant by the Nigerian playwright Femi Oshofisan. So, but I know we've pushed you a lot with questions, very tasking questions, but there's one more. And after that question, you are free to say, well, you've had enough. But if you don't mind, this question is from another attendees, wanting you to say something about the goals of literary anthropology for literary scholars who want to know about this field. What does it mean? I mean, how do you understand it? And so what is literary anthropology, if you don't mind?
Well, I think, it's a field that, of course, is still relatively young, and I don't think we have seen all of its possibilities yet, although there is already a lot of diversity in it. You're finding book theories in literary anthropology. I would suspect that people sticking to what should I say, more established forms of literary scholarship would sometimes wonder and say, what is this? Finding that it doesn't conform to the established rules of literary scholarship and so on. But then, well, I think, give it time, and also if you are in comparative literature studies or something like that, well, take a bit of time out to familiarize yourselves with the various expressions, and there are so many of them over this field. Generally, well, through my academic life, I guess I have frequently been inclined to sort of look across disciplinary borders and find that, well, I get a lot of not only reading sort of fiction and so on, but looking at what literary scholars do, what historians write, what political scientists write, what sociologists write. We should be concerned about competence and not doing things too badly, but we should not be too respectful of disciplinary boundaries, I think.
Okay. All right. Okay, well, actually, another question came in, but since I promised you that was the last question, I don't want to trespass on your generosity. And it's kind of related to the question that you just answered. It's about relationship between literary ethnography and also the idea that African literature is often received ethnographically as some sort of informational text rather than creative text that may not have any relationship to facts as such. But as I said, we did task your generosity, and I think it would be a moment to say thank you. Unless you have some parting words that you want to share with members of the association, I'm happy to give you the last word.
Well, I would just say that, I'm sort of envious of the field of an African Literary Association, because there's, of course, so much to do. And let me just also say that, okay, so by now my time is approaching 6:30 in Sweden, and so I guess we've been going on for a while, but it's certainly been among the very nicest conversations I've had in my village, even if it's a long distance conversation, sort of for certainly all of this summer and so on. So thank you all for having the patience to listen, but also to come up with questions which I found, stimulating, trying to answer. So thanks.
All right, thank you very much, and thank you to people on YouTube and on other platforms where this has been broadcast. We appreciate your time with us and for the very stimulating questions, even on the say-so of the lecturer, Professor Ulf Hannerz. It's been a wonderful time to spend the past hour and a half with you. Thank you. And again, I just wanted people to be aware that a free e-copy of this book, Literary Anthropology, Afropolitan Horizons towards a literary anthropology, essays towards literary anthropology of Nigeria, is available on the website of the publisher Beghan Books. Beghan Books for free download. I think you have to do some kind of registration, but you don't have to pay anything for it. And thank you for that generosity again. And so hope you have a good evening. You said it's closer to 6 p.m. in Sweden, and we'll hope to see you at some other time. And our audience, again, hope to see you back next month, when we bring another set of scholars to discuss their work with us. All right, thank you very much, and have a good rest of your weekend. Bye.